All right, let's talk about MMT, modern monetary theory. And this is one of my favorite topics of all time. And why? Because debating MMT, it if you like to talk about politics at all, this is at the crux of the issue. It's a clash of two visions. One, the more libertarian vision, and the other, more of like a socialist vision, where the government, there's a group of people in the government or very smart, empowered political leaders can guide society, and the other side thinks that's not good. They can't do it. They don't have enough information, and eventually, you will get into like libertarian pulls, conservative pulls one way, a more socialist pulls a different way, and the argument can be boiled down to modern monetary theory, well, at least in America anyway. So basically, what is MMT, modern monetary theory? It just simply states that if a country is powerful enough, it has like a world reserve currency like the United States, or the Britain that has the British pound. Basically, if it borrows in its own currency, then it can print as much money as it wants, and it can manipulate the currency and control, basically use that money to either cut taxes or to spend on social programs. And it might not have negative ramifications, or a lot of proponents of modern monetary theory say, let's say, you have a lot of room there. That once inflation starts, the only downside would be inflation, and once inflation starts picking up, they can suck the money out of the economy by either cutting back on those programs or increasing taxes. But as long as as long as they borrow in their own currency, they can do that. Other countries, smaller countries, can't do that because lenders don't trust other smaller countries. Like some countries, any country, like the Russian ruble, or an African country, or countries in South America. Well, they borrow money. They borrow capital, but the capital that they have to pay back is denominated in U.S. dollars most likely. So they can print as much money as they want, but then that means their debt is going to start inflating. So that's not going to be good for them. So proponents of MMT, that's what they're proposing for America, or they're saying, hey, look, the U.S. dollar is a reserve currency, and we have a lot of there's a lot of people around the world that use U.S. dollars, and we have a lot of room here. The government can create jobs, create a ton of employment through some kind of like city works or whatever, or run free healthcare. And how we're going to pay for this? Well, we could just create more currency units. They have some economic logic that would define it, and just like, oh well, that's how any dollars are created. The government just creates dollars into existence, and if there's too much inflation, they're saying the only limits are MMT are physical resources. So let's say the U.S. government wants to start building buildings out of gold. Well, there's a limited supply of gold, so even if printing more currency units won't really help. It'll cause a lot of inflation in the gold because there's we're limited by physics here. But they're saying, hey, there's a lot of unemployment people. There's a lot of room to grow here. We can run a bunch of employment programs, just printing money. The only downside, if inflation starts to rise, we just need to increase taxes, or by when the government increases taxes, when you give government money, your tax dollars, that basically the government destroys the money. so it causes the inflation to go down, or it could just cut that spending altogether. Now, in a perfect world, like technically, in a hypothetical laboratory experiment where everybody is a perfect actor, kind of like socialism, it could possibly work. The only issue is we live in a real world with real people, and people have flaws, and our political system has flaws, and people have weaknesses. Just like in socialism, people are self-interested. So what are the huge fatal flaws with MMT? Or there's an article here by Zero Hedge. It outlines two obvious ones, but I can think of a few more. So, MMT, or modern monetary theory, offers a new monetary logic that allows government to spend without concern for debts or deficits. Does MMT seem too good to be true, or does MMT fatal flaw render it troublesome? On the heels of unprecedented spending and unmanaged deficits, MMT is gaining popularity. Its acceptance is not only surprising, as principles justify reckless fiscal behavior. MMT advocates are loud in their support for unlimited spending and mock the thought of too much debt. We often fail to hear them highlight the critical governor in their theory designed to limit inflation. The current bout of inflation exposes the fatal flaw. Alright, before discussing two inherent flaws with MMT, it's worth briefly summarizing what the theory entails. At its core, MMT states the government can create money via fiscal policy. Currently, all the new money is lent into existence by the banks. Under MMT, Congress and the President will get a new printing press and print to their heart's content. Debt would no longer be needed to fund government shortfalls. The current deficits become irrelevant because the government can print money to satisfy its debt requirements. Accordingly, without debt and deficits, MMT is a dream for politicians. The only flaw with this theory is inflation. If the economy reaches full employment and inflation becomes a risk, the discipline of MMT says taxes should be imposed on individuals and corporations to limit spending and to reduce inflationary pressures. Measuring and managing inflation is where MMT will fail. Well, the United States, this is my opinion, United States enjoys by being the reserve currency of the world. And why is that? Because back in the day, the U.S. dollar was backed by gold, so people trusted it. People still trust it and transact in it, and actually, a lot of people holding their wealth and using U.S. dollars prevents even more inflation. Right now, we're experiencing extremely high inflation, but we would have even more inflation if the rest of the world didn't use it. But because the rest of the world uses it and uses it as a store of savings, our inflation is limited. But if people all of a sudden lost trust in the U.S. dollars and wanted to get rid of it and started putting their wealth in Bitcoin or whatever, all the dollars around the world will come flooding back into the U.S., and that would create a tsunami in inflation. Now, I think before MMT would even get off the ground, people would hear about it. Meaning, people hear the news. Oh, the U.S. government is now just adopted this new theory where it can print as much money as it wants. Well, do you think that people around the world with their life savings in U.S. dollars, what would they do? They were like, oh shit, sell, and trade for gold or anything tangible. So this would be a tsunami of inflation hitting the U.S. But wait, there's more flaws. MMT, fatal flaw number 1, measuring inflation. The first flaw is measurement of inflation. The article mentioned above, we state, inflation is impossible to calculate. Inflation is impossible to calculate. No, that's not a typo. For emphasis, let's put it another way. Inflation is impossible to calculate. The point that inflation is impossible to calculate cannot be overstated. Inflation is not measured in any uniform manner. We can compute general gauges of inflation, but the degree of accuracy is highly questionable. Just consider the difference between inflation for a 45-year-old couple with 3 kids living in New York City and a retired couple living in New Mexico. MMT requires precision that's not possible. Making the task even trickier is the conflict of interest between the users and reporters of inflation data. The government agencies report inflation. Congress and the President control these agencies. As such, the power to manipulate inflation data and have a strong interest in reporting low inflation numbers. MMT increases the need to underreport inflation, which is true. I mean, currently the inflation in the United States is at 6.8%, but everybody knows that that's complete bullshit already. It's because the way they calculate housing prices. But if they were to go back and actually do the real calculations how they did in the 70s, inflation would be way over 10%. So there's that. But here's a doozy. MMT's fatal flaw number 2, political willpower. The second more vexing problem with inflation is politicians' willpower and vested interest. Should we expect elected officials to reduce spending and raise taxes when inflation is problematic? One needs to only consider the current environment when answering this question. Current political willpower, inflation is running at 6.8%, over 3 times higher than the Fed's stated 2% objective. The media and populists are steadily increasing pressure on the administration and Congress to combat inflation. At the same time, wages are growing but are at a lesser rate than inflation. Average hourly earnings are 4.8%, while historically strong real wages, factoring inflation, are down 2%. With stimulus largely spent, consumers are reducing savings, increasing credit card debt, and withdrawing equity from the houses. These are signals that lower middle-class families are falling behind. Under MMT, the government should be raising taxes to reduce consumption to fight inflation. Furthermore, they would need to raise taxes on all the income classes to be effective. Raising taxes on just the wealthy would barely dent the spending habits of the rich and does not affect a large percentage of total consumption. Demand will not be meaningfully affected unless lower middle incomes are taxed. But here's another thing. I mean, this article doesn't even state something that's even more absurd. Let's say they use MMT to create jobs, and they use MMT for free healthcare. Now, either once inflation starts running hot, either they start raising taxes, which is extremely unpopular and would get, basically would get politicians kicked out of office, ruining their careers, which I know they're not going to do. Or would they have to actually cut the jobs and cut people's health care? That's impossible politically. Both of those, you're between a rock and a hard place. I mean, I can't even imagine how bad that would be. The type of stories the media would run about, oh look, because of some bullshit, some academic nerdy pants with thick glasses, he says, quote unquote, inflation's too high, so therefore we can't buy grandma, their life-saving procedure, or this father of 5 got fired from his government job. They can't do that. And as I stated in the beginning of the video, this is the actual crux of MMT argument. And I mean, I'm sure it'll come up later, as they might not even call it MMT, they might call it something else. But this is the war, political, ideological war between limited government, between people who think that the government should be very limited, or at least not even limited, but it should have a hard currency that's backed by gold or backed by something serious, like maybe a crypto, that they just can't make more units. So if they wanted to raise spending, they would have to painfully raise taxes on people, which is politically unpopular, so it's basically a self-balancing The more they spend, the more they need to raise taxes. Well, taxes are unpopular, so they can only spend so much. They would have to cut, self-regulate and cut other programs. So there's a limit to the spending. Or does somebody believe that you can have a group of elected politicians, or maybe not elected, but just people at the Federal Reserve or whoever, a group of experts that can fine-tune society, that can create more money, create jobs, create free create healthcare, free healthcare for people, basically improve the society, and know the exact amount they can do that, so that if inflation starts running hot or something is going wrong, they can pull back, not rip the rug out from the economy and completely collapse society, but they just have all the controls and they can fine-tune these knobs. I mean, I'm in the first camp. I think they can't. Our opinion is not biased. There are very few politicians on either side of the aisle willing to raise taxes and lose their power. As politicians constantly remind us, retaining control tends to trump doing the right thing in Washington, such as a mindset bodies poorly managing inflation under MMT. Proof from the Fed. As you see more evidence of Washington's lack of willpower to tackle inflation, look at the Fed. Despite red-hot inflation and maximum employment, this politically independent body runs crisis-level monetary policy. They have dragged their feet for the last 9 months as inflation soared well above their objective. The Fed is finally concluding that inflation might be a problem as inflation hits 40-year highs. So, summary. Inflation is MMT's fatal flaw. Inflation is a fly in the MMT's ointment. I wouldn't say the inflation is the real problem. I would say the political system would be the real problem. Maybe if there was like some super powerful AI, I mean, people would never go for this, give up democracy to have some super powerful AI that would basically control the money supply and then would have measures, could measure inflation, measure employment, measure whatever, and somehow start calibrating the supply of money. But that's never going to happen. This is going to be run by actual human beings, and these human beings are self-motivated to stay in power. Or even if they do sacrifice themselves, they will be, kicked out of office, and new politicians will be elected promising the moon. The current high inflation episode exposes MMC's fatal flaw. Despite the flaw, we suspect the push for MMT will continue, and the rules around inflation will change, allowing for more inflation. Without stringent inflation guidelines and willpower, MMT is nothing more than a printing press for the government. Historically, MMT-like schemes have always resulted in default. We do not doubt that the adoption of MMT leads us on the same path. And this article is actually kind of right. I really wanted to hear... Okay, so inflation is running hot now. And when people were calling for MMT, I remember Chelsea Kelton, I think her name is, some prominent economists, they had some ammunition because during the 2008 real estate crash, the government printed a whole bunch of money, QE, and there's been multiple recessions where the government flooded the economy with money, bailed people out, but the inflation was always very low. So they could say, look, we have we could print so much more money. We have a ton of room to grow here before inflation could be a problem. We can give people free stuff, free healthcare, free whatever, free jobs, employ them. But now I'm thinking, well, look at this. We've printed a shit ton of money and inflation is running super hot. Now, do they have the willpower to slam on the brakes? Or are they, which I'm thinking, they don't have the willpower, they'll just have to throw the US dollar under the bus.